Hey guys, this is Dave with Audio In. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Tangzu Fudu. This is Tangzu's newest entry into the sub $100 market, and I've had a few of their IEMs come across my review table, including the Wan, which is my current favorite ultra budget IEM. But up to this point, those have all had either a single dynamic driver or planar driver configuration. And from what I understand, this is Tangzu's first ever hybrid design. So I wasn't sure what to expect with the Fudu, but this is the kind of stuff that always makes a review a little more interesting. So as usual, we'll go over what's included in the box. I'll talk about the specifications and design, then we'll get into the sound. In the box, we have the IEMs and cable, and this being a collaboration with Divinus, they've also included some of the Divinus Velvet ear tips along with Tangzu's Tang Senkai ear tips. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Also included is a soft carrying pouch. As for the price, specifications, and design, the Fudu comes in at $89, and as I had mentioned, it has a hybrid driver setup consisting of a single 10mm dynamic driver plus two balanced armature drivers. And the drivers are housed in a 3D printed resin shell. However, the outer faceplate is actually machined aluminum, so it's very light, but still feels quite robust. And it's also shaped really nicely, so I was able to get a really comfortable fit, and with both the Velvet and Senkai ear tips, I had no issues achieving, again, a comfortable fit and a proper seal. So both sets are great, but I think I actually prefer the grippier texture of the Senkai tips just a little bit more. The cable is also really good for the price. I like the gunmetal colored hardware. It looks really nice, and while it is fairly soft to the touch, it can be just a little challenging to untangle. It attaches to the earpiece via 2-pin connectors and has a 4.4 termination, which I can definitely appreciate. And I really do love the monochromatic aesthetic. Of course, this is the Fudu Verse 1 Zen series, so they've definitely embraced that Zen minimalist approach with the all-black design and the angular cut faceplate. But from an aesthetic standpoint, I think they absolutely nailed it. The Fudu has a super clean, minimalistic look, and the build quality overall is simply excellent in my opinion. As for the sound of the Fudu, this has been a fairly interesting review process for me, because one of the things I try to do is determine whether or not an IEM has a certain standout characteristic or displays certain attributes that I wouldn't expect to hear at this price point. And a lot of times an IEM at this price point might sound really good and have a generally pleasant presentation, but maybe not necessarily have any unique attributes that might bring it up a notch in terms of general performance. And the truth is that the attributes that are kind of hard to find or rare, not impossible, but hard to find within the sub $100 price range are, generally speaking, neutral tuning with good technicalities. And of course, there are exceptions like the Truth Air Hexa, but most of the time, I can expect something in this price range to basically have a more bassy or fun tuning approach with average to below average detail. And if I'm being perfectly honest, that was kind of my experience with the Fudu. But let me be clear, I'm not saying that this type of presentation sounds bad. I actually like the Fudu, and I think as these types of tunings go, it is well done. So just to be clear, I do think the Fudu generally does sound good. So let's talk about that. We'll start with the bass first. The bass was actually the first thing I noticed because it kind of stands out from the rest of the frequencies. Not that it dominates the overall presentation necessarily, but the overall signature does seem to lean in favor of the bass. And while I wouldn't consider the Fudu to sound unbalanced, I would have preferred there to be just a little more energy in the upper mids and upper treble. The bass isn't necessarily the fastest I've heard, so it's going to give you a more smooth bass presentation. I do think it could use a little more dynamics as well. There is good bass extension, so it's not lacking at all in terms of sub-bass rumble. As a matter of fact, I would say it has more of a sub-bass focus. And there's also a fairly substantial amount of mid-bass presence as well, which adds lots of note weight to instruments and male vocals. And along with the bass, another attribute that really stood out to me was the amount of richness and warmth in the Fudu's overall presentation. The trade-off, of course, being that there is also some bass bleed, which does affect lower mid detail. Aside from that, the mid-range does sound pretty natural, and while it is slightly recessed, instruments and vocals still have enough energy to maintain good center focus, although I do wish there was just a little more mid and upper mid energy to help balance out the bass. As for mid-range detail, aside from the bass bleed in the lower mids, things do clean up as you move up into the upper mids, giving some instruments that land there a little more clarity. So detail levels are pretty good overall in the upper mids and treble, but still only what I would consider to be about average for this price range. The treble presentation is definitely overall on the smoother and inoffensive side. So while cymbals and hi-hats generally sound natural and never sound peaky or harsh, which makes it pretty easy on the ears, they also could use just a little more detail and crispiness. So I wish there was just a little more energy in the treble. And the same goes for the upper treble as well, because there just isn't a whole lot of energy past 10K. And what that affects, of course, is the air and sparkle. It's just not quite to the levels I generally like to hear. And that does affect micro details as well. Now, as for technicalities, we already know the detail levels are just okay. As for the soundstage, I would say it's intimate at best. Instrument separation is okay, although imaging does lack a little focus. So I would say in terms of technical performance, it's slightly below average for this price. As for where it lands in terms of the competition, I would say its overall performance is about on par with the CVJ Freedom and the CVJ May, although I would give the Freedom the edge in terms of detail levels. It's still definitely not to the performance levels of the Galileo. The Galileo, of course, has a much more balanced presentation. Vocals and instruments sound much more natural, and it just has more detail as well. So just to summarize my thoughts on the Fudu, aside from it not having the detail that I typically like to hear at this price point, I did still find its overall sound enjoyable. And I would say my favorite part of the presentation was its bass, because that was the attribute that engaged me the most. And even though I wanted more treble energy, the overall treble presentation was still relatively natural, smooth, and again, it's easy on the ears. And at the end of the day, even though there wasn't anything about the Fudu that necessarily wowed me, at the same time, it was very inoffensive and it was just generally pleasant to listen to. So I still got a lot of enjoyment out of it. And I also want to mention the ear tips, design, and build one more time. Both the Velvet and the Senkai ear tips are very comfortable, although I do think my favorite of the two is still the Senkai. I just prefer its grippier texture over the Velvets. Now, as for the design and build, again, I absolutely love the minimalist design approach they took, and the build quality really is excellent at this price point. So that concludes my review of the Tangzu Fudu. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would, please like this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.